I'm realizing more and more that to build an industrial company at scale in any country, you have to have government supporting you. We are the beneficiary of a $100 million DOE grant, which is paired with some funding from the state of Michigan as well. And it was a 3-year process to secure that grant.
Something I'm actually now beginning to fully appreciate is my role to be effective in academia is actually now aided by what I have experienced in industry and entrepreneurship. My students really like it when I'm able to share with them my experience as an entrepreneur, because many of them will go on to work in industry and be entrepreneurs themselves.
One of the benefits that Will has as a professor at Stanford is intelligent, well-capitalized people with lots of exposure in politics and policy come to him. They don't come to Mitra Chem necessarily. They're coming here to give their thoughts and to seek feedback and counsel about much broader megatrends.
Welcome to the Stanford Ecopreneurship Podcast, where we explore how university research moves beyond the lab to shape real-world impact and climate solutions. I'm your host, Sam McClure. This is our Academic Innovator Series, and today's guests are Professor Will Cheuh and Vivas Kumar, the co-founders of Mitra Chem, a battery materials company. Will is a faculty member and the director of the Precourt Institute for Energy. His work bridges fundamental materials science with deployable clean energy technologies. And Vivas is Mitra Chem's CEO and a former battery supply chain lead at Tesla. He brings deep experience in scaling technology through industry collaboration. We discussed how government partnerships enabled their entrepreneurial journey, why timing is everything when launching deep tech ventures, and how working with incumbents can accelerate climate impact. It's great to have you.
It's wonderful to be here.
Great to be here.
I want to go all the way back to the beginning and talk maybe, if you don't mind, about early childhood and early childhood experiences. So, Will, if you wouldn't mind, what was the intellectual environment of your childhood? It's not every person that grows up to be a material science professor at Stanford. So was there an early context in your childhood that sort of sowed the seeds for that?
If it's okay with you, Sam, I'd actually want to talk about why I became an entrepreneur.
Sure.
And so let me take you all the way back to when I came to this country as an immigrant. And the year was 1993. I came with my brother and my parents to Los Angeles when I was 10 years old. And at the time I spoke no English. The only sentence I knew was, "How are you? I'm fine, and you?" And here I am. And when I came to this country, our family didn't, have a lot of means. So making a living was very important. And I don't tell the story very often, but one of the first things we did was my parents started a small import-export electronics business in which they imported things from Taiwan, where I'm from, and sold it here. But where we sold it was actually at swap meets. I think many people don't probably know the concept today, but we went to empty parking lots and sold stuff. And that's when I realized buying things is really easy. Selling things is really hard. And actually, that's what motivated me to become an entrepreneur, to think about, how can we make businesses successful? And I really appreciated this experience I have as an immigrant, because I came to the US, I embraced the American dream, did all my education here, and then find my calling in the area of energy technologies and solutions. But it all really goes back to being an immigrant. And I think I'm still very much pursuing that American dream. Yeah. So that's all the way to the beginning in this country.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Yeah, well, when you went to Caltech, premier technological university in the LA area, and it's just bachelor's, master's, PhD, straight through material science. And I'm curious if there was any zigzag in your path, or was it material science all the way? And sort of when did you know that was interesting to you?
Something I will talk about later today as well, it's really all about the timing. And the year when I started at Caltech as an undergraduate was 2001. And that's roughly when sort of Clean Tech 1.0 started. And as I was doing my undergraduate education, actually was in applied physics. And I said, well, it seems like this is really taking off. This is when solar was starting to get inexpensive. Batteries was not yet on the roadmap. And there was still the discussion of the EV1 electric vehicle. Nothing we have today was there. But that was near the beginning of this 25-year journey for energy technology and energy solutions. And I decided that I want to do something quite different that's at the beginning of something, as opposed to be at the middle of something. So I think that's also my entrepreneurial bug sort of reminding me, do something different, do something creative, take a lot of risk. So I decided at the time that I want to do some research in fuel cells. And at that time, that was a very esoteric topic. And at that time, batteries was maybe $5,000 a kilowatt hour. Today, it's 100 times less, $50 a kilowatt hour. So it was very difficult to imagine what energy technology have become today just from that vantage point. So I was really glad to have gotten started near the beginning of Clean Tech 1.0. And I really credit this to being inspired by my mentor and teacher at the time, who got me from applied physics into material science, because I was really convinced that new technology solutions largely rely on new materials that have not been discovered and are not manufactured at global scale. So that was my foray into material science and clean tech.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, in Vivas, you were in a family that was in the energy industry from early on and traveled around the world and grew up with this varied background. So I wonder if you speak to that a little bit.
I think a lot of what Will said resonates with my background as well. So I moved to the United States when I was also 10 years old. I moved from Singapore. My parents had been in the oil and gas industry their entire lives. It's a very global industry by its nature. So the opportunities to move to a lot of different countries were certainly always available. They chose the United States because they believed that this is where we could get the best education for myself and my brother. And that's what's given me the opportunity to go to a school like Stanford as well as part of my trajectory. But I was inspired to go into the energy industry. I was inspired to follow in their footsteps. But my parents made it abundantly clear when I was coming of age and studying engineering that the best days of oil and gas were probably behind us. And this is when there was a lot of conversation around peak oil. And the peak of a commodity also means the peak of opportunities for people to be economically empowered in that industry. And so their advice at the time was take the engineering knowledge that you have and apply it intelligently to where the new frontier of energy is going to be. And that's what led me to ultimately moving to Silicon Valley, going to work at Tesla. So we're recording this podcast in fall of 2025. It's been nearly 10 years since I first was a supply chain manager at Tesla.
Yeah.
Very different company back then. When I was telling people that I was going to move to Palo Alto, California to work at Tesla, there were still a lot of people who asked me, what is Tesla? And when the Model 3 came out in 2016 as a first concept, it was clear that either this thing was going to bankrupt the company or this thing was going to make the company. And luckily for me, but also luckily for the world at large, the latter is what ended up happening. And so being part of that entrepreneurial experience, working with Elon, having the opportunity to work with a very committed group of engineering-minded problem solvers to will the impossible into reality showed me the power of entrepreneurship and the intersection of entrepreneurship and clean energy technologies. And so when I came to school at Stanford and had the opportunity to meet both Will and our third co-founder, a gentleman named Chueh, who is also the CTO of our company, the three of us realized that we had a shared passion of solving problems in the battery space and electric vehicle space, but most importantly, in bringing forward materials for the new frontier of energy.
Yeah. So did you, and I want to ask this question of both of you actually, but did you ultimately end up at Stanford for graduate research, or in your case, a faculty position, because of this culture of entrepreneurship that you perceived?
By virtue of having lived in Palo Alto while working for Tesla, one of the things I noticed as I got more deeply interconnected with the ecosystem that is Silicon Valley is every one of the world-changing companies that has been founded in Silicon Valley for the last 75 years at this point has basically come out of this campus somehow. So for example, I'm a Stanford MBA graduate. Will, of course, has been at Stanford for 15 years as a professor. Chueh, our co-founder, was a postdoc at Stanford previously in Will's group. And so there's a lot of Stanford connectivity over there. But think about Intel, think about Apple, think about, and I know people are going to sit here and say Steve Jobs dropped out of college. Well, who funded Steve Jobs in the very beginning?
Sure, Arthur Rock and a bunch
Exactly.
of
You're
other
talking about a
Stanford
bunch
grads.
of Stanford guys who invented venture capital, who saw the promise of his technology and brought him out. So by no means am I saying if it doesn't start at Stanford, it doesn't matter. No, what I'm saying is in Silicon Valley, there's a track record of Stanford being the center point of lots of innovative companies coming out. And I wanted to be part of that.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I applied to come to school over here and had a wonderful time doing it.
Yeah. And what about you, Will?
Well, I couldn't have said it any better. I think what I will maybe augment a little bit is, one of my objectives as a teacher is to have the opportunity of working with the best talent. I remain with full conviction that anything we do, it all boils down to people. So the better talent you can work with, the more likely you're to succeed, in case in point here. And when I came to Stanford, I was really drawn to, I would say, not by the entrepreneurial ecosystem that I discovered later, but was by this very feeling that many students at Stanford really wanted to change the world. And that type of feeling is infectious. And you come on campus and everybody, this desire of changing the world is really powerful because some of them do end up doing just that. And as teachers and professors, our goal is to surround ourselves with the best talent, right? You have interesting students meeting one another, interesting students and professors meeting one another, and interesting professors meeting investors, right? So Silicon Valley is just a dense place of capital, of talent, of ideas. And elsewhere in the world, you also have those as well. But I think arguably, this is where the density is the highest. So if you think about the probability of collision, this is also where things are most bound to happen. And I think that's one of the two layers of the recipe to success is having great talent come from all over the world, ourselves being examples of that, and then providing an ecosystem to increase frequent collisions. And I think Stanford is very much at the center of that.
Arun Majumdar, who is currently the dean at the Dorr School, is the one who basically put Will and I together and said, and he did it in a very mentor kind of way, right? He didn't say, hey, go start a company. He said, I think the two of you would get along and the two of you have very similar ideas that you can work on. And then allowed us to have the space to go and fill in the blanks ourselves. Because he saw something in us that we couldn't have seen, which is that we both had an entrepreneurial streak and we had complementary ideas, and we were both at the right time in our lives to where starting a company could have made sense. So this was in March of 2020. As a matter of fact, it was the last day before Stanford shut down for COVID.
No kidding.
And Will and I met at the faculty club, and we didn't end up chatting too much for about 8 or 9 months afterwards because life was just confusing during COVID. Sure. But
I think I called you on Christmas.
You did call me on Christmas, and the ideas were baking, during that time. And then, and Christmas is very close to Will's birthday as well. So I think he was in a reflective mood, around that time. And then when we got back in January is when Will pulled in our third co-founder, Chueh, and then the three of us actually started taking a more concerted effort around figuring out, okay, we know that there's three major problems with the battery supply chain. It takes a very long time to bring battery materials products from lab to market. There's too much of an emphasis on nickel-rich cathode active material, which isn't suitable for mass market applications. And too much of the supply chain is concentrated with assets that are being built in China today. Can we come up with a company that can tackle these problems over the next 10 years to set up a 50-year vision for a materials science giant? And that's how we got started.
I also had the opportunity recently to think about what were the most important ingredients in launching Mitra Chem. And I'm going to be a little provocative here and talk about the three ingredients, which I think can be generalized. I think the ingredients are ideas, people, and timing. Now I'm going to rank them, right? So I'm not going to rank them by importance. All three are very important. But I want to rank them by how irreplaceable they are. So ideas can come and go. We can develop new ideas in the next hour. So I put idea as on the bottom of this 3-tier. People, it's possible to change people, or to recruit new people, bring talent, but they're definitely more difficult to change, especially for a startup, compared to ideas. Sure. The one thing that's almost impossible to change, or put another way, it's locked in on day one, is timing. If you get the timing right, man, you're on a streak. But if you get the timing wrong, even with the same people, the same idea, nothing will happen. So that's how I think about sort of the three things. Yes, you need great ideas, you need great people, but the one thing you need is great timing. Some entrepreneurs are sort of on the clock and said, well, I'm going to graduate, I'm going to start a company. I think in both of our case, and with our co-founder Chueh as well, there wasn't necessarily a timeline to do it. I myself have been waiting for years. I started at the intersection of AI and batteries more than 10 years ago. And Mitra Chem wasn't launched, 5 or 6 years into that process. And in a manner of speaking, I was waiting for the right time, right? Because I knew business is cyclic. I knew that if I started at the right time, I can raise the necessary capital, I can attract the best talent. Heck, I can even get the best ideas if I start at the right time. But the timing was everything. So I think it was timing that also brought the two of us together, because we met fortuitously. We did not intend to meet. I wasn't out there looking for a business partner. We just met through the introduction of a Sage console that knew the both of us. And then we took the opportunity and then we continued nurturing it and letting it grow. But I think this timing aspect cannot be more important. If you get the timing right, that makes maybe 1 to 2 orders of magnitude for the same idea, even the same people. And that's one thing you cannot change, is timing.
Yeah. So timing has clearly been really important to you and the company. And in this moment, this 2020 and 2021 moment, we had a lot of political change, right? With the change from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And we also had supply chain disruption with the COVID pandemic. What was it that was so special about that moment, and why was it the right moment for Mitra Chem to get going?
The administration change from the first Trump administration to the Biden administration further just strengthened the resolve of bipartisanship around the core theses with which we were focused on building this company. Whether you call it industrial technology or climate technology, EVs were the focus of both parties, and industrializing the United States to reduce overdependence on China as a result of what happened during supply chain dislocations related to COVID was a trend that was going to continue no matter what. And so when we saw that these were major megatrends that were immune to political winds, it's very rare for something like that to happen, especially in our fractious political times. So that to me was a big indication that the thesis of wanting to build a US battery supply chain company that then ends up becoming a US material science company, that the timing was right, that there was going to be a policy directive, a legislation directive, and a government funding directive towards building a company like this. All three of those elements, legislation, policy, and funding, did inevitably come together to help our company get to where we are today. And, Will has spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., continues to spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. I think he can tell you a little bit about the work from the Department of Energy that he did that saw, where he foresaw that opportunities for funding, especially from the government, were going to come in a once-in-a-generation manner.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely spot on, Vivas, that with the opportunity we saw was, I would say, the intersection of several things. Number one, it was the maturity of the technology. So if you go back to the 2020, this is basically, when the Tesla stock went through a step change. And that was sort of the first big sign of success that, electric vehicle is going to be transformative. It's going to be mass market. And I would argue this is sort of the last possible moment to start a battery materials company. Many battery materials companies started way before then. But in terms of timing, this is when you have that confirmation that this is going to make it, right? This is going to follow the path of solar in terms of the cost decline. And we saw huge cost decline just even since 2020. So that was the maturing of this particular solution space, not batteries, but in terms of transforming mobility. That's one aspect. I think the second aspect was also this growing realization that we can't be using a technology that was developed mostly for consumer electronics. Even for the battery technology used in Tesla vehicles, it was borrowed from, this might surprise some of you, camcorders. Those cylindrical batteries that goes in the back of a Sony Handycam were not very dissimilar from the ones that went into the first Model S, the Roadster. And the realization that, the market is 4 orders of magnitude greater for mobility compared to consumer electronics. So fundamentally, the chemistry would have to change. So that was the realization that there may be supply issues due to the fundamental nature of which elements we use from the periodic table. So for example, a lot of the batteries at the time use cobalt, which is more scarce, more expensive. Certainly, almost all the batteries use nickel, and that is also getting increasingly more constrained, and we saw that play out through the next ensuing number of years. So that was the realization that the step change in the demand will also warrant a step change in the chemistry. So Vivas and I and Cheuh saw the need to choose a chemistry that's more scalable, and we saw it, I think, just at the right time. It was invented decades before us, in Texas, actually, by Professor John Goodenough for lithium iron phosphate that uses iron rather than cobalt and nickel. So I would say that's the second ingredient of recognizing the need for more abundant supply. And the third one, which I think is very significant, was there has been decades of the United States ceding manufacturing capacity and industrialism to other places like China, but this was creating a lot of imbalance in the world and trade deficit. And the final thing, the signal we saw, was the United States was ready to bring these manufacturing capacity back because of the need to have a more secure supply chain in order to sustain the growth of auto industry, which is very central to the US economy. So those 3 things came together: the maturing of the market, the recognition that supply will be constrained, and to think about this need for manufacturing that is regional and in order to provide the necessary security for the nation. So these 3 things, I think, came together in that 1 year. And plus, there was a fourth, I would say, a surprise element, was we saw AI was getting mature too. Because we're talking about developing new battery chemistry, scaling up manufacturing, improving manufacturing yield. We saw the opportunity that artificial intelligence can really speed that up. Then we asked the question, what would a company founded in 2020 or 2021 do with AI that other companies founded before then could not do? Then that's when we found the true value of entrepreneurialism is then we get to do something that others cannot as easily do. By talking to other industry, the difficulty of bringing AI into well-established companies who are in this space. So I think that fourth surprising element was icing on the cake to the 3 fundamental ones that I mentioned.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you could have just said we're going to build a battery based on iron and be really good at that, and that's our model. So we're doing this one thing. But you've positioned yourself a little bit more as a technology platform or a development platform. So Vivas, maybe you could speak a little bit more to sort of how you see that.
Well, if all we were going to do is build the best iron-rich cathode manufacturer in the U.S., that's not a long-term winning business, because ultimately manufactured products come down in cost over time. And in a long enough trajectory, your margins are going to go to 0. So you always need to have a growth path. Either it be new geographies where you're expanding, new products where you're expanding, or a new approach to product development that allows you to be faster than the rest of the competition. And so when I said that we wanted to build a company for 50 years to be a material science giant, it wasn't simply about, can we make the best LFP cathode today? It's, can we make the best LFP cathode today and then find the abstractable competencies from the process of having made that cathode active material and apply those competencies to different chemical spaces which are also relevant to the key technology trends that we're going after. So Will talked a lot about AI as being an enabler for our product development efforts, but AI is a megatrend is beyond just this company's product development. There's a massive demand now for data centers. Well, those data centers also need energy materials and cooling materials.
Sure.
So the potential new product spaces that we can enter as relevant to AI is now well beyond just LFP. And those are conversations that we're having internally right now as well, which is now that we have de-risked an LFP product and we're deep in customer conversations, what is the next space for our growth? Is it more LFP outside the USA? Is it a different material to support the needs of the AI industry as it grows?
All of the above.
All of the above, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so you really shipped product too very, very quickly. You have shipped and probably will continue to ship product very quickly. And we see other battery companies that sort of get stuck in garage mode, or they tinker for a long time, or they have difficulty getting commercial batteries to market. And I'm curious if this was just the natural result of the approach that you're taking and the sign of more to come from Mitra Chem, or did everybody work 110 hours a week for 9 months straight to get this done, or again a little bit of all of the above?
While the initial launch of the company fundraising was straightforward, we sort of also hit a downturn in growing the company. 2022, 2023, 2024, these are not great years for venture capital. But there was a benefit to this, is when funding is challenging, partnership is the way to address and mitigate. And I think these funding challenges led us to partner with incumbents who know how to manufacture, who know how to scale, partnership with our customers, partnership with our supplier, partnership with manufacturers who have the know-how and experience that we can then sprinkle some of our new insights into. And if I look back maybe even just 3 years ago or 5 years ago, when other companies in our space started, funding was much more abundant. So then many of them opt to do certain things themselves without necessarily embracing partnership. So I think the funding crunch actually motivated us to find capital-linked ways to do things, not just necessarily doing things ourselves, but also embracing partners who can bring a lot to the table so we can do things faster and with less capital.
Well, speaking of partnership, the partnership between the two of you is fundamental to the success of the business. And you remain on faculty here, as many professors who watch this or listen to this will, right? They will stay on faculty. And so there's this interesting dance between being a part-time co-founder who's adding a tremendous amount of value because you're bringing so much of the technology and R&D sensibility to the company, and also not being a day-to-day operator in the way that Vivas is. So maybe you could speak to how you make that work. Like, what was the initial conversation around time commitment or cadence of one-on-ones, or what contributions were going to be coming from which direction to make this thing go?
I think Will was very upfront when we started the company that the first 3 years was going to be heavy time allocation from Will at Mitra Chem, and then set us up on a path to where Chiru and I can mostly run the day-to-day of the company, and Will step back from a lot of the day-to-day decisions. And that's basically what happened about 3 years in, but that doesn't mean that conversations are not continuously ongoing.
Sure.
And much of the interface that Will has with our company now actually is mostly him coming abroad with either me or Juan or Chiru to go and meet with our core partners. It's not about time allocation as much as it's about what drives value. And I know that a lot of professors are going to be watching this. One of the benefits that Will has as a professor at Stanford is intelligent, well-capitalized people with lots of exposure in politics and policy come to him at Stanford, right? They don't come to Mitra Chem necessarily.
Right.
And so they're here at Hoover, they're here at the engineering school, they're here at the business school. They're coming here to give their thoughts and to seek feedback and counsel about much broader megatrends, which then affects the way that Will thinks about what is the positioning of Mitra Chem within that broader megatrend. The same is true of me to a certain extent. So if I think about the three co-founders of this business, the person who was most in the office is actually our third co-founder, Chiru. That's because he's the CTO and our office is a lab. And Chueh has done a tremendous job of building a technical team around himself. But a lot of what I was doing, even in the first 3 years of this business, was spending time getting the company capitalized. A lot of time with investors, a lot of time with commercial counterparties, because that's where my previous experience as having been a commercial manager at Tesla most lent the credibility that I had to ensuring the success of this company. Sure. Over time, what we found, though, is the three of us have had a bit of a mind meld where we've all learned from how each other works, and we've all learned a little bit about the topics that each other is working on. And so now there's more overlap in the responsibilities and the problem solving that we do. I don't have to be in every investor or commercial conversation. Sometimes Will just takes those on, right? Likewise, if Chueh is not able to make a very specific technical decision, Will has enough context to do it.
Yeah, that's powerful. Given that you are running a lab, though, what was the communication around access to you in the day-to-day? And I'm asking this very specific question because I think the audience will have this very specific question. And I imagine that some professors might say in your position, I'm coming into the office a day a week. That's my Mitra Chem day. I'm going to be doing other stuff outside of that. Let's try to stack all decisions and conversations in that day. And I imagine other professors say, it's more flexible, it's more ad hoc, text me anytime, email me anytime, and it'll sort of add up to a few hours a week that'll be extremely high value hours because I'm able to be really high leverage. How did you balance that, or how did you balance those responsibilities for the first few years?
Well, Sam, this is a great question. Let me zoom out for a second and say my philosophy has always been do what I can do uniquely at a given time to contribute value, as Vivas pointed out. And it's a moving target, right? As Vivas mentioned initially in the founding of the companies, first we were in Vivas's garage, and then we were in Palo Alto. So I would come very often and be really engaged in, designing what the lab would look like. I would be looking at equipment purchases because there was no one else to do it. But of course, as we brought talent and we got really good people, then other people are better at doing those tasks than me. So I continuously search for what new things I can do that only I can do. So I think to other academic co-founders, always be looking for that unique value you can bring. I think it changes maybe every quarter. And something I want to highlight here as well is I think it is really important to be flexible with your priorities. In academia, we run on a really good cadence, right? It's quarter by quarter, it's week by week, there are homework assignments, there's a thesis defense, it's like clockwork, right? Academia is extraordinarily predictable. That's the nature of academia. None of that is true, as both of you know, in business. So I've always prioritized the volatile nature of business in terms of time and requirement. Vivas calls me and says, hey, Will, we need you to come with us to this international location. And it's like, okay, let's go, right? Because academia's cadence and rhythm gives us the flexibility elsewhere. And companies, one decision or two can make or break the company. So you have to really look at it carefully. Whenever the company would need me to do something that I can do uniquely, I need to jump in and do it, right?
But it happens in bursts of activities, right? And so right. If we think about this year, for example, so we're recording this podcast in September of 2025. You and I have been to Korea twice together this year, and Korea is where we have our biggest office outside the United States. And there are 3 other international trips tacked onto the Korea trip that you've taken on behalf of the company. So those were individual weeks. There was a massive burst of activity that Will took on from Mitra Chem. And then sometimes there's like 2 weeks where I don't talk to Will. But it's not because there's no value to contribute yet. It's because when the time comes, I know I'll call him in. And he knows that if I'm calling him, it's a serious and urgent matter.
And also I want to go back to what Vivas mentioned earlier. I see a great deal of intersection at my work here at Stanford and in entrepreneurship. Because, obviously, we keep things separated to manage any potential conflicts. But inevitably, I'm working on materials in academia, I'm working on materials in Mitra Chem. So the communities, the people very naturally intersect. And sometime wearing my academic hat gives me a much greater perspective. Actually, this is what we spend a lot of time talking is, what is that bigger perspective, right? Because sometimes when you're wearing the company hat, the entrepreneur hat, you're very narrowly focused. And sometimes it's easy to miss something that's happening at a larger level. So we constantly talked about strategy. Is this the right way to frame it? Do we have the right objective? And because we're talking to the same people in academia and in industry, then we get to wear different hats as faculty and academics to think about, do we have the right framing? And I'm very fond of saying framing the right question is 2/3, right? Execution is 1/3. If you know what question, what objective to define, and that is going to largely determine whether you're going to succeed or not. The rest is a race, right? But I think for Mitra Chem, we were very privileged to have found very good framing to begin with, and then the team executed relentlessly toward that. But having that framing and continually updating it is very crucial. And I think academics are quite good at zooming out. Being at an institution that is more than 130 years old, we have these relationships that last for decades. And that actually can be an extremely complementary to the much shorter term and the cycle time of entrepreneurship, which are measured in years as opposed to decades.
You've been very thoughtful about this from the beginning and the positioning within mega trends and sort of figuring out how your communication to investors, which are sort of a different set of stakeholders than your employees, different set of stakeholders than maybe your partners or suppliers. But you have to be very up to date on the policy landscape because of the nature of your business. And so I'm curious if you have a policy function built out. Do you have a head of policy? And you had mentioned that you're in DC with some regularity, or that policy folks come to Stanford. So Vivas, how do you as the CEO think about bringing in that broader policy narrative into the day-to-day work and integrating it into what the engineers are thinking about or how product teams are making decisions?
That's something that actually surprised me with running this company. Is I underestimated how much time I'd be spending on policy analysis and on government relations.
Sure.
And I'm realizing more and more that to build an industrial company at scale in any country, you have to have government supporting you. We are the beneficiary of a $100 million DOE grant, which is paired with some funding from the state of Michigan as well. And it was a 3-year process to secure that grant. But it wasn't about the capital from the government, because the United States has very well-developed private capital markets. It was more the validation that we got from government. Nobody will diligence us more than the U.S. Department of Energy.
Sure.
And so the validation that they chose us while simultaneously not choosing our competitors allowed us to put our best foot forward in private capital markets. When the Biden administration changed over to the Trump administration, there's always a risk that there could be policy changes. The opposite has happened. So the new Trump administration has taken on a very strong posture towards manufacturing in the United States, towards reindustrialization of supply chains, towards blue-collar job creation. And something that we've noticed is the state of Michigan, where we will be building this facility, is blue on all 3 chambers. And the federal government right now is red on all 3 chambers. And yet the same value proposition is given to both. And they both love the fact that we want to build a specialty chemicals product that today is 100% manufactured in China, creating 200 plus blue collar jobs with an international partner who's also interested in investing in the US for a supply chain for a critical material to empower new technologies in the US.
Right.
So I can say this to anybody of any political stripe, and they love to hear it. Also, I will say I have been surprised at how much time I find myself spending in Washington, D.C., and how much I enjoy doing it. Like, I used to previously think that going to D.C. was just a checkbox exercise, that you had to go and visit your representative, tell them about what you're doing, tell them about why it's important to their community, and that's it. That, you do it once every 6 months or so. And ever since President Trump has been inaugurated, I've gone to Washington once a month, and I've gone to the White House 4 times.
Wow.
And I intend to keep going with regularity, because even having the privilege to sit in the room to shape the conversation on these topics is not one that's afforded to many companies. And we're lucky through connections that Will has, but also through the connections of our general counsel, Ross, through some of our investors, to have access And with this access comes a lot of responsibility. It's responsibility not only to empower our company, but to empower the entire thematic around which we're building.
Sure. I'm actually curious if, you said this, the same pitch works for both Michigan and at the federal level right now. Do you find yourself swapping any words out on the pitch deck? Are you saying climate tech in one room and industrial tech in another? So you make some adjustments, but more or less.
What Will said at the very beginning about selling is hard, when you're speaking to politicians, their incentives are very different than the incentives of a capital markets allocator and of a customer. Politicians want to know that their constituency and their interests are being taken care of so that they have longevity in their career as a politician. You need to tweak the message for the audience so that they are empowered and inspired to help you. If we go and talk about climate change to an audience that's not friendly to climate change, they're not necessarily going to care. Of course, I'm very personally fulfilled by the idea that I get to spend my time working on being a small part of a larger solution for climate change.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily have to be what I lead with in every room I walk into.
And that's probably one of the most difficult learnings of a new CEO, right? Is that it's a communications function in many respects, and you have to wear not just 2 different hats, but maybe 7 different hats, right? Because of all the rooms that you're moving through. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Both of you have had this idea that these government partnerships with academia and with the private sector were powerful, right? What led you to that belief or that interest? Have you just always understood, if we're going to do something meaningful in material science or in battery technology, government's going to have to be involved and we need to be pursuing these partnerships, and I want to be involved in that conversation?
I think it's how academia works. If you think about who our closest partners are in terms of supporting our research and educational mission, you have government, you have philanthropy, and then you have industry. Of course, you have other academia as well. So, we're trained to interact, extensively communicate with these key stakeholders. It's not possible to have academia thrive without interaction with without any of those stakeholders. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, I think, one of the most important keyword that we mentioned earlier in this conversation, which is ecosystem. At the end of the day, without ecosystem, we are just individuals. We're an individual company. We're an individual faculty. Stanford is a collection of individuals, right? But Stanford is powerful also because we have this enormous and an incredible ecosystem. Silicon Valley is in itself an ecosystem. I think something that worth highlighting is as we stitch together these partnerships across academia, industry, government, philanthropy, it is a creation of an ecosystem. And something I have learned is that our role in it is, in fact, this is my personal learning, is you want as much exposure into each role yourself if possible. And this is not surprising if you look at many of our leaders at Stanford. They spend time in industry, they spend time in entrepreneurship, they spend time in government, right? We have many former cabinet members. We have CEOs and chairmen of major corporations running the university. So Stanford is a place where I would say we are encouraged to explore these many roles and then at some point bring it all together. So that is the journey that I am on right now, as I'm trying to experience these various perspectives, because they're very different, actually, if you think about it. Coming from the entrepreneurial side versus the academic side, they're totally different. And government and policy has its own requirements as well. And they all operate at a different cadence, a different timing, different set of values, different sets of objectives. And something I'm actually now beginning to fully appreciate is my role to be effective in academia is actually now aided by what I have experienced in industry and entrepreneurship. As a light example, my students really like it when I'm able to share with them my experience as an entrepreneur, because many of them will go on to work in industry and be entrepreneurs themselves. So having that experience really helps. When I talk to my government colleagues, they also value my dual experience. The academic experience gives me objectivity and looking at things strategically. But when I put on my entrepreneurial hat, then I know the economics driving it. I would argue academia provides kind of the opportunity to let these experiences intersect. And I think to my faculty colleagues, I think this is really a valuable experience. I think it would be an extraordinarily missed opportunity if we don't connect the dots across these key stakeholders because we have the luxury to engage all of them. And I'm now beginning to see in my various capacity at Stanford in how my own entrepreneurial experience is now shaping how I work with government on the policy side, I work with advising students, even in the classroom setting. This very conversation is also the coming together of these various experiences. I'm extremely thankful that the academic environment has given me the freedom to try these various things out and seeing how they intersect. Yeah. So at the end of the day, I think it's really about creating gravity. So by having these various experiences, then we can think about how to create gravity, to bring them closer together, to align, and then to achieve objectives that it's not possible if you only had one perspective.
I'm curious, just to key in on that briefly, Will, if there could be a single institutional change to improve this ecosystem, connecting the dots, or to straighten out the pipeline of R&D to entrepreneurship or real world impact, what do you think that single change should be?
I think the output of academia is rapidly changing. And I think our evaluation system needs to catch up as well. So this is not a call to action for Stanford, but for academia more at large, is can we measure impact in different ways on the educational front, on the research front, on entrepreneurship? What can we do to really deliver our social contract? Most universities globally are funded with public dollars, right? In addition to private and then philanthropy dollars. So we have an obligation to deliver something back to society. So I think in fulfilling the social contract, we must also be willing to redefine the output of academia more broadly as we think about what is impact. And then to incentivize students, faculty, staff to adjust and pivot to optimize for impact.
Which goes all the way back to the Stanford Founding Grant, useful to the world. I'm going to give you, Vivas, the honor of the last question here, and it's related to what Will was just talking about, which is this idea of impact. Obviously, Mitra Chem, it's in the private sector. You're setting up a tremendously large outcome because it needs to make financial sense for your investors and for other folks. I'm curious if you have measurements of impact other than dollars and cents, and how you think about that impact question in your role as CEO.
Dollars and cents will come if you create a product that matters to the world. And if you create societal prosperity by creating lots of jobs, then the impact will be self-evident, right? So let me just put it that way. It's dollars and cents are the last thing that I measure, which is ironic to hear the CEO of a private company say that, right? It's kind of against my incentive to say that. And this is a very oft quoted letter at the business school, but if you read the 1997 Jeff Bezos Amazon shareholders letter, he talks about this concept of we are here to create long-term shareholder value rather than optimizing for short-term stock market fluctuations or figuring out how do you engineer more profit out of each individual quarter. And you draw the lines out from 1997 to 2025 on that company. Look at how much they've done.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of kudos goes to the founding team for making that happen. They never lost sight of the fact that the value of the company was in customer delight. Likewise, let's take my former employer, Tesla. If you read the master plan written by Elon in 2006, it was all about how do you ensure that as many humans as possible can have access to an electric vehicle, because this is the mobility solution that decreases their carbon footprint the most. If you look at what Bill Gates said when he founded Microsoft, it was how do we get a computer in every single household? These are bold and grandiose visions about how humanity can be bettered by technology rather than about optimizing for the next quarter's profit. And so when I think about how we're going to build a material science-focused company that spans the test of time over the next 50 years and creates trillions of dollars of value. It's what are the products that matter to enrich humanity? What are the material science problems that can contribute to people living better lives? How can we create jobs, and how can we get those products to be as low cost as possible to proliferate them to as large a market as possible? And the money will be made.
Yeah, I believe it. Well, thanks for the time. I think we'll leave it there. And this was really fun. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sam.
Thanks for coming in.
Appreciate it.